Nitro means high performance. Just ask a pro.
One of the greatest things about the 185 is it's a fast boat. If you need the speed to get somewhere, the 185 will get you there in a hurry.
Nitro, explosive high performance.
Bass Pro Shops Outdoor World Library, presented by today's foremost professional sportsmen, who will share proven methods and techniques that will help you become a better and more successful fisherman.
Larry Nixon has fished professional tournaments for the past 14 years. His success on the pro tournament trail has been as a result of careful attention to detail, learning everything about successful bass fishing, and then putting that knowledge to use on the water. He has translated that success into an impressive list of wins, including every major bass fishing tournament and award. In 1983, he won the Bassmasters Classic. Larry is the only person to win 3 BASS Megabucks. He has qualified for the Bassmasters Classic 14 years in a row. In 14 years, Larry has won over $1 million. As a result of this, in 1990, Larry Nixon was inducted as a legendary angler into the Freshwater Fishing Hall of Fame. Larry Nixon's tournament tactics for locating spring season bass is your chance to ride along with a pro as he establishes a successful pattern for bass under springtime fishing conditions. In 4 days of fishing, Larry will demonstrate how fishing can change from day to day and how you can establish these changing patterns.
Over the past 15 years, I've fished tournaments on hundreds of different lakes, all the way from Guntersville, Alabama to the St. Lawrence River in New York to Lake Ouachita in Arkansas and Toledo Bend in Texas. A bass is a bass. He relates to the same situations, maybe different types of cover, no matter where you go. These techniques will help you no matter where you're fishing. This is one of the most unique opportunities for a bass fisherman that I've ever saw. This particular lake that I'm fishing has so many different colors of water, so many different water temperatures, and I'm going to combine all of this into one tape. It's nothing I could shoot in one day. So it covers a lot of situations that you're going to have in many different reservoirs. Come along with me for the next few days and let me show you how to put together some springtime patterns that'll work no matter where you're fishing.
Day 1. The forecast calls for clouds, high winds, and a 70% chance for rain. A strong cold front is approaching from the north.
One of the hardest things to determine in springtime fishing is exactly what phase the bass are in, and that's why it takes so much time to locate fish, because there's so many different things they can be doing right now. A lot of lakes like this one here, this particular lake that we're on, it has a lot of underwater vegetation, has a lot of submerged bushes, a lot of flooded bushes, and boy, there's just so many different patterns that these fish can be on, and I do a lot of my fishing based on water temperature. We're looking at 53-degree water, which is really pretty cold for this part of the United States. And, you know, so many times when you've got water temperature that cold, your fishing really just does not get good till 11, 12, 1 o'clock in the daytime. So the main thing is just don't give up. Keep trying the patterns that you think should work, and just keep moving around and looking for that right pattern. Now, I think these fish right here, right now, should be on a pre-spawn pattern, which means that they're just now going to be moving in. And I'm going to work the outer edge of these bushes. Give it 2 or 3 hours. pick on the point stuff, the big bushes closest to deep water. Check and see if the big fish have moved in yet. Then a little later on, I'm going to move on out there and start working the grass. That way you can kind of work bushes a while and then work grass and come back to the bushes, because you really just don't know when these fish are going to pull in. A little sunshine would be the main thing here. Them fish like that sun this early in the spring. A lot of people think they don't like sun. They go to them bushes for shade, but tell you what, right now that sun's a very important factor, because it'll pull the fish in shallower quicker. You know, your main baits this time of year, that's pretty simple. Some sort of crankbait, a jig, and a spinnerbait. To me, that's going to be your 3 key lures, and that's the lures that you need to key on and stay with, because you can cover a little bit of water and see how aggressive and active the fish are. But right now, with that water that cold, I'm going to predominantly stay with a jig and a crankbait, because I just don't think them fish are going to be in there real shallow yet. When you're looking for fish on one of these lakes that has a lot of different cover, like milfoil or hydrilla and bushes, and I mean, just got a little bit of everything that the bass like to use as cover, you got to go through a system of eliminating grass and eliminating bushes and going from one to the other, because like I say, they just sometimes they move up and sometimes they don't. And grass is always a key factor in any lake you go to if the lake does have vegetation in it. Got to fish a bait that'll get down there close to that bottom and move along rather slowly. You want to use something that'll just get down there and clip the top of that grass. Slow moving spinnerbait, lizard. A lot of times maybe a diving crankbait, you know, if the fish are real aggressive. And when I'm out here looking for fish in this vegetation, normally I like to get on the outside edge of it where the grass is as deep as it possibly is, and just let the wind or the breeze blow me right along top of it. Just work away all the way across there. Go from the deepest point to the shallowest point, and then back off to the deepest point. And when you catch a fish, throw out a marker buoy and mark your area, and then start working that area a little more thoroughly and try to come up with as many different patterns or as many different baits as you can get the fish to hit. This time of year here also is pretty difficult, because when you have these severe cold fronts come through and really chills that water back down, a lot of times it pushes the fish back on a semi-winter pattern. They go right back to the points and the structure edges. Get on a good little ridge and work this area for 3 or 4 or 5 hours and cover the whole thing till you figure out what's going on there. Later in the day, when everything starts getting warming back up a little bit, maybe the water temperature comes up a few degrees, that's when you want to go start moving back into the pockets and the bushes, hunting for them fish that are coming back shallow, because they're the easiest ones to catch. That fish was pretty close. He was right up against that bush. He's cold too, look at that. Boy, they're sluggish, 53-degree water. They really ain't moving much at all. He was just there. That's one of the things about fishing this wintertime fishing, or really, it's not really wintertime fishing, it's real early spring fishing. And the fish are just moving in, and boy, the bite is just so soft. You just pick up on that jig and it's just heavy. They just got it. Now, I always let that tell me a lot about my fishing, the way a fish takes a bait. If they get it going down, that means that I'm going to make a lot more casts and not really worry about working the bait back to me. I'm going to just start pitching and covering more ground. Not only that, see, we got into a lot clearer water here, and when that water temperature is real cold like that, boy, them clear water fish, they'll bite before them dirty water fish do. You know, one thing you really got to pay close attention to when you're fishing this shallow water type of of cover is the type of brush. You know, when you have willows and a mixture of buck bushes, one day your pattern will go from willow trees to buck bushes. And that's something that you have to kind of work out as you fish, because it'll happen on a day-to-day basis. And right now the fish are on these deeper bushes, or it seems like that fish back there come off of a deep willow. But a little later on, they're going to be right on these little old, what I call buck bushes. They grow in a little bit shallower water than the willows, and as the fish get more towards spawning, they'll start moving on up in that shallow water. Now, even when you think that you've got the pattern wired, like on fish on them point willows or buck bushes or whatever you find them on, and you go back in a cove, you always want to watch the bottom of these little coves or channels in a lot of these lakes, because they have either little creek channels, definite little creek channels, or like this particular lake here, they have a lot of vegetation right in the bottom of them. And every now and then there's some big schools of fish that start migrating back in these coves, and they'll be right down in the center of these channels hanging over the top of that milfoil or hydrilla. So as you're coming out of a pocket, always look for that other pattern when you've not got the right kind of brush to pitch your jig at. Just pick you up a crankbait and work right down over the top of that hydrilla and stuff that's out in the middle of these coves. Nearly all the fish that come back in any creek or pocket or whatever, they follow a certain route. And usually they either follow the underwater creek channel that's in there, or they'll follow the weed lines. And a lot of times you can get on 2 or 3 different types of patterns, you know, on one particular lake.
Day 2, the first day after a cold front. Temperatures overnight fell to 30 degrees. The forecast, highs in the 50s, clouds and sun. Winds from the southeast 10 to 15.
When looking for bass in real shallow water conditions, when you've got a lot of high water and you've had a lot of rain, your lake's come up, it's got way up in the bushes and up in the grass and stuff like we have right here, one of the most effective lures for looking for fish in this situation is a spinnerbait. And, you know, depending on how cold the water is, that's the way I like to select the type of spinnerbait that I'm going to use. And it's pretty cool right now, so I want a bait that I can fish down, get it down under the surface, and just keep the boat out to where you can reach the bank and pitch that thing up in the cover in the shallow stuff, and fish it back to the boat real slow, because fish are probably going to be real sluggish. And that's why you want to fish it down. Kill it every now and then and let the bait sink, and let it fall down beside the brush and the cover, and you know, just keep moving around. That's what a spinnerbait, that's what makes that spinnerbait so effective, is you can just cover so much water with it, and you're got a moving bait there with a lot of flash, and it's something that a fish is looking for. It's probably the most effective lure for looking for springtime bass, simply because you can cover so much water with it. Here's another real important lure when looking for bass, is a long A, or the minnow plug. It's probably the most perfect imitation of a bait fish that the fisherman has to look for bass. And when I'm really looking for bass with a long A, it's a jerk bait. I pop it under the water, giving that thing real short pops and getting it down there and letting it pause. And you give it 2 or 3 twitches and stop it and let it pop back up, and then just keep jerking it. Don't ever let it float all the way to the surface. Most of the time I'm working it just on strictly a jerk and a retrieve. 2 or 3 little pops, get it down there, stop it. When the fish aren't coming all the way up, maybe in real cool situations, the pausing of this bait, when it stops, that's what triggers them into biting. You give it 2 or 3 jerks and stop and let it float up just a little bit. It's an extremely good method, or good lure, to use when you're covering a lot of water and looking for fish. And that's probably one of the things that's hard about finding bass. People have a tendency not to move around enough. With this particular lure, you can just keep on moving the boat and keep casting and going around the shorelines until you do catch a fish. And this will tell you exactly, you know, it helps you to figure out and determine exactly what part of maybe the cove that the fish are on. There's lots of times in the spring of the year when you're hunting fish up in that shallow water, and you know the bass are there. They just got to be there. And there is lots and lots of times that we actually fish where fish are, and yet we don't fish our lure right. So when you're out looking for bass and you hear that they're being caught on a minnow plug, then there is different techniques of catching bass on this bait. And a lot of times, especially when that water gets up above 60 degrees, that throwing it out there, letting it hit the water and just lay there on top and give it a little twitch and let it sit there on top again and give it another little twitch. A lot of times that's the way that you trigger fish into striking a minnow plug. So be sure and watch for that particular type pattern once that water starts warming up in the 60s, because when the fish go to the bank, they won't hit it when you're jerking it. You got to let it lay there. So be sure and don't overlook that. Probably the most popular of all fish finding lures is the vibrating baits with the rattles in them, rattle and spot. This is probably, well, without a doubt, it's the most popular lure there is in the USA right now for hunting for bass, because it's such an easy lure to fish. When in doubt, tie it on, keep your boat somewhere in water less than 7 foot deep, and just throw it out and wind it back. There are certain times when retrieve speed might be pretty important. Maybe when the water's real cold, you want to slow it way down and just barely move the bait along. But most of the time, it's a medium to a high-speed retrieve, either around grass or bushes or whatever type cover you're looking for. And it's just something that fish can't stand. I don't know. There's something about all them rattles in there vibrating that it just really produces a lot of fish. And the ordinary bass fisherman can catch fish on it, whether he is an expert or just a beginner, because it's simply just throw it out, wind it in. It does its own thing. I like crawfish colors in the spring. When I'm looking for bass in the springtime, I'm thinking about a fish that's been out there in that cold water all winter long, and he ain't seen a crawfish since last fall. And one of my favorite lures for all bass fishing, and one that I depend on more than any others, is a craw worm or a plastic worm, some sort of a plastic bait. A lot of times we just fish where fish live and just fail to use the right lure to get them to bite. Especially in the spring of the year. I mean February, March, April, you should never get in the boat without a worm or a jig one, and sometimes both. A lot of times when you're not doing any good up in them bushes, them fish get out here in this main lake, see where there's no grass. I just come out of a big weed bed there, and I'm coming up on a clean spot. There's a sandbar right there where there's not any grass at all. See, and that's what you want. You want to pull up on top of these sandbars and work the perimeter where that grass is. And we pretty well eliminated, there's not too many fish in them bushes, so I'm going to stop out here and try one of these sandbars and see if maybe these fish out here in this a little bit deeper water will cooperate a little better than them shallow fish. Oh, he just barely tapped that thing. Well, maybe we finally got something going. We've tried a little bit of everything. Got out here on one of these exposed ridges, about 12 foot of water, scattered hydrilla. These fish just ain't went to the bank yet. Rigged me up an old black and blue craw worm and on a Carolina rig so I could cover a little more water with it, and picked up a fish. A lot of times when you're looking for fish out on these exposed open water ridges, is what I call them, they're surrounded by grass, you can cover them much more efficiently with a Carolina rig. Either a lizard or a craw worm or something rigged up about 2 foot behind your slip sinker. This allows you to fish a little bit faster, and it gets your bait up out of that grass just a little bit. And a lot of times they'll take it a lot better than they will a Texas rig. There's so many things to take into consideration when you're looking for fish in the early spring, and boy, that water temperature is so crucial. And right now we're looking at severely cold water for this part of the country, and these fish are being extremely difficult. And, you know, it just gets better day by day. You have to watch that sun and the wind and the fronts, and the water don't have to improve much. Just come up 4 or 5 degrees and get up there around 60 degrees, and these fish get real active. Didn't even know he was on there. He is so cold. Look how white that fish is. I'll tell you, these fish ain't happy, and just barely got him. I mean, just barely. Tell you what, that's that's pretty tough fishing when you don't even know you had a bite. But I finally got something going. Beat them bushes for a day and a half, and the fish just ain't in there. They done pulled back out on here. They're kind of in a almost went back to a winter pattern. But that's the way spring fishing is. They can just go, it can go from being so good to so bad in just 2 days. Now turn around 2 days from now or 3 days from now, the fish will be right back over there in them bushes. Once you've caught a fish out of an area like that, on a worm or a jig or whatever, and you feel like there's more fish there, then you want to switch to a crankbait or something that gets down there and runs pretty close to the bottom, and you know, work that area a little more thoroughly with a crankbait, because a lot of times there's more fish there and they won't all bite the same lure. That's why you switch lures when you work a lot of these holes. You might catch 2 or 3 on a worm, and bang, catch 2 or 3 on a crankbait, and switch back to a worm, catch 2 or 3 more. And you want to be versatile. Don't get hung up on one lure, especially when you find a spot that you feel like's got fish on it. Right under the boat. Just barely. Look at that. I mean, just right in the corner of the jaw. That's bad cold fishing. See that grass blinking on the depth finder down there? Just perfect. Good fish. Wow. Fish was out over that submerged grass. I just reeled that thing in real slow. Ooh, and I barely got him. One hook. Oh, don't you get off of there. That's a good samragger bass. Good fish. About a 4-pounder. Beautiful fish. He is suspended over that grass. That's a good bass. Come back and see me someday when I need you, big girl. There you go. That's a nice fish. That's the kind of fish you like to catch right there. Out here on one of them ridges, them fish just come plumb out of them bushes and moved out here on this open water and went back into a not a real aggressive pattern. Just get that bait down there where you can feel that grass and let it back up out of it a little bit. You know, a lot of times fishing springtime, when you're talking about fishing the shallow water and moving in out of that deep water and getting out here, we're getting up in shallow water. A lot of times you don't necessarily find a big bunch of fish. It's not like summertime or fall of the year when they get stacked up in places. In the spring, many times what you get on is just a good pattern. Sometimes you only catch one here and one there. Other times you find maybe one little grass bed that's got a little bunch of them in it, but like what I've got done here in the last few minutes has got a little bit of a crankbait pattern going, and so it's a matter of following that weed line and just staying on it where the boat comes out of about 12 foot of water and jumps up on top of that grass, and just following that grass line with the depth finder, and you just catch one here and one there. Same way with fishing bushes. A lot of times it's just an isolated bush pattern and you're only going to catch one, and you just have to keep the boat continuously moving searching for that right bush that's in that right position. When it's real cold like this, a lot of times they like that bait stopping and going. They want it to hit that grass and then just pause. You know, we always dream of finding that little glory hole where you just sit there and tear them up, but so many times bass fishing, it's a pattern. It's what we call pattern fishing. Just one here and one there. We've got the depth of the water down right. Like I pretty well figured out now that most of the fish that I've caught have been in 11 to 12 foot where it got dropped off into 14 or 15 foot in that grass, and they're on that inside weed line. They're not on that outside edge. They're on the inside weed line. So I just have to keep covering water and maneuvering around and just catching one here and one there. A lot of times when people are out here on these ridges, I see them trying to find fish on these open water ridges in these lakes, and so many times most of the bass are away from the bank. They really are. If you've got a lake that has ridges and grass beds in it, the fish like to get out there on them ridges, and that's where they stay because they feel more secure out there. And I see people having troubles finding fish out on these bars, and the way I look for them is find me a flat area on a lake. I'm going to and I'll go over there and just run back and forth across it with my boat looking at my depth finder. And when I find one of these little spots that's surrounded by grass, it's what I call a little underwater bar, and I'll put a marker buoy on it, and then I'll run plumb back past it till I drop off in the deep water, and I'll work that section all the way to that marker buoy until I drop off in the deeper water on the other side. And I'll use a variety of the lures that I've showed you, and usually, if it's real early in the year, your most effective bait is going to be a crankbait of some sort. And you want to get one that has a lip that'll get down there deep enough to where you can bump that grass. And use light line. I'll use 10-pound test line because I can get it down there a lot deeper. And you want one that don't clog up in the weeds all the time, where it just hits the weeds and you can stop it and it'll back out of it, and you can continue your retrieve on across there, and it'll just hit every now and then. So sometimes you have to experiment. You might want a little bit bigger one if the grass is down there deeper, and you might want a little smaller one if the grass is shallower, closer to the top. And two of my favorites is a rattling spot. Now, if the grass is only 4 to 5 foot under the water, you cannot beat this particular type lure right here. And usually, I'm going to use one of 3 colors early in the year. I prefer crawfish. This seems to be the #1 color for me for at least 3 months, and that being the early part of the spring. And as soon as it starts clearing up good, maybe the fish are a little more aggressive and sometimes they want more flash, that's when I like chrome with a blue back. The situation we have here on this particular lake right now is quite a bit of off-color water, and chartreuse is going to be a color. It's one that has a little bit more shine. The fish can see it a little bit better. This particular bait seems to be running the right depth right now. The grass is down there 8 to 9 feet under the water. And on a long cast, I can get this lure down to where it just bumps that grass. And right now, at this point in time, that's the best pattern that I've found, is fishing the grass where it's surrounding some kind of a little sandbar, and these fish seem to be relating right to the edge of that grass, where the grass is in 9 and 10 foot, and then it just breaks into clean water. You know, this chartreuse bomber, it's a 7A. That particular model bait has, boy, it's been so good for me. In the 1988 Megabucks tournament down there in Florida, I took this same crankbait, only in a different color because of the watercolor down there. I threw a fire tiger in Florida, but now I'm throwing a chartreuse with an orange belly. And that one day I had 7 fish, weighed 30, I believe it's 32 something, 32.15. And this bait here will just catch fish year-round on pretty well any lake. If you've got the right conditions for a crankbait, you can't hardly beat that 7A. That gum didn't no more throw it out there. Whoa, that feels like a good fish, too. Right plug, big fish, good fish. Identical to that I caught earlier. Come here, baby. Careful. Big old white 5-pounder. Now that in there hit that bait with a little authority. Daytime, you know, the timing, when you're fishing out here in the early spring like this, your late afternoon hours are always going to be the best time of day to fish. So
you know, don't give up just because you hadn't caught anything at 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning, because usually they just don't turn on until somewhere between 2 and dark. That's a nice bass. Catch you some other time, dear. These fish are just now beginning to bite a little bit. You know, it takes time to get a good pattern going. I mean, I've been out here for a day and a half now looking for these fish, and I've been up there in the shallows beating them bushes, and you know, everything over there looks great, and the fish ought to be there, but we've had some cold weather, and these fish have just moved back out, and they're not in there shallow right now. Tomorrow, all this may change, so you've got to be able to come out here every day. But see, once you get a good pattern going like we've got here right now, what you can do is first thing tomorrow morning, you can come out here and work this particular pattern for 3 or 4 or 5 hours, and if the water warms up, gets up there 57, 58, 59 degrees, run back in a pocket and look for another pattern.
Day 3. Sometimes the toughest day after a front is the second day. The forecast calls for clearing skies, high near 60 degrees, with the winds becoming southerly from 10 to 20.
You know, this is day 3 out here on this lake trying to find some fish. And got on a pretty good pattern yesterday. The fish seemed to have moved out away from the bank and got out over the grass. And another cold night last night, water temperature down to 52 degrees today, and I've switched areas here. I'm in a little bit more off-colored water, so I'm going to have to fish a little bit slower today. I've got a bright spinnerbait on there, and the grass is up closer to the top, surprisingly, in this particular area. And that's one of the things you have to look for no matter where you go is when you switch areas and go to another area, watch that watercolor change and try to read it and determine how the fish are going to react in a different particular area. I expect the fish to still be offshore in this area because the water is so cold. But I'm going to have to fish a little slower, a little brighter baits, and the main thing is be patient. Most of the fish that I've found so far have been out here on these little humps, and one thing, this is kind of a pre-spawn pattern, but really it lasts all throughout the spawn because there's a continuous movement of fish coming in out of that deep water, and they use that grass and them little grass lanes as migration ways to move on back in that shallow water. And it's not going to be long. I mean, not too many more days. All it takes is a few days of warm sunshine and not a lot of wind, and these fish are going to start going toward that shallower water because your best spawning depths are somewhere between 8 foot and less. And usually that means closer to the bank or maybe on a shallower bar out here in the main lake. But the next place these fish are going to set up, or they're going to be setting up, is on them point willows or the point bushes. And they'll pull in there, and that's another stopping place. They'll stop there for a few days. Sometimes it's just a continuous migration point. The same bush may produce a fish tomorrow and the next day and the next day. And then you just have to proceed on in there in that shallow water, and that's when your moving baits get a little better. Your spinner baits and your long A's, your jerk type baits, your minnow plugs, your lizards. Once the fish get on in there and get in that 3 to 5 foot water and go into the spawning process, that's when your other baits will produce a little bit better. But it's a following process, and one day a front comes through, the fish in shallow may quit, and you may have to move right back out here on these bars to find these fish that are out away from the shoreline. So you have to change every day, and a lot of days, I mean, even now when the water gets in the low 60s, be real careful, because even though you've got them wired in there in that shallow water, they may not be in there early in the morning. There's certain days, especially right after this pre-spawn period, that they don't move in till 11 or 12 o'clock. So, you know, you kind of have to get a feel of what the fish are doing every day. And there's another thing that you got to really start watching for, and that's after the lake has had a lot of pressure, a lot of tournaments maybe, or a lot of people out here fishing, and that's when the wind is going to be your friend. Right now, I want to fish areas that don't have wind because that water is going to warm up quite a bit quicker. But a little bit later on, especially when that water gets in the mid-60s to low 70s, that wind is going to make the fish a lot more aggressive. They're going to hit a lot better, and wind is going to be part of your pattern. So you want to be real careful when you're out here fishing, and think about what the conditions are and what the bass have been doing, and this will help you to become a better bass fisherman as you get more experience in the sport. You know, the kind of weather conditions we got here today, this is just probably the absolute worst conditions you can get for bass fishing. Anytime you get real slick, bright sunny days, they're the best you can possibly get for making fishing better tomorrow or maybe late this afternoon. But when you get out here early in the morning like this and you got ice cold water and pretty dingy water like this, there's a lot of times, especially in these lakes now that have a little vegetation, well, really just any kind of lake, that you're a lot better off picking you up a worm or a lizard or a jig and slowing down a little bit. When you're not catching any fish, you get around an area you feel like it's got a few fish, just go ahead and slow down and spend about an hour or so with a worm or a crawl worm or a jig, and you know, see if that might make a little bit of difference, because they don't always chase when it's real still like this. Just took a switch of baits. Got me a bait that'd go stop and go rather than a constant movement. Don't believe he's a real big fish, but he's not too bad. Nice white one. Good 2-pounder. I don't know how to grab a hold of him. I tell you what, boy, when they get suspended in cold water, even on them clear water lakes, that spoonbill, that thing, you dig it down there and just kill it, and boy, they just something they really like about that thing. When it gets tough, that water gets cold and that pre-spawn, I can just catch more fish on spoonbill than I can any of them other baits. So many times this time of the year, we have a tendency to fish under the fish with a worm or a jig. You know, some days they'll take a worm or a jig better. But then again, there's times when they're coming up, you get a pretty day like this, and they want to look up in the air. They want to feel that sun. You know, I realize that most lakes, or a lot of the lakes across the United States, are not really like this particular body of water here and don't have offshore weed beds and ridges and humps and stuff. And you just have to take that lake and put it in its own category, whether it just has straight banks and pockets and coves and bushes and logs and laydowns, and you look at that lake and you say, well, this lake here, it just don't have that stuff. So you say, well, the angle of the bank is the key. To me, when I go to another lake that doesn't have the offshore cover, then I start looking at the angle of the shoreline, and that's how I try to put my patterns together according to the fish. The slope of the bank, usually you go back in the pockets, you find a little bit more flatter water. Your pre-spawn areas are going to be points and bluffs leading into some of these nice big flat creeks, pea gravel banks. Whatever this lake has to offer, that's where you look for your fish. You go about it the same way. It's just you're fishing shoreline instead of offshore structure or offshore ridges. And you still got to go through the same processes, the same lure processes, but your key there, slope of the bank, because this is that's what the fish relate to. They got to relate to that shoreline. They don't have anything else. Yeah, so it's you reading the bank and looking for the correct angle of the bank. That watercolors, you know, that's one of the most important factors in any lake you go to. Usually your fish turn on first on the lower end of the lake where it's clear. Even if it's a rock bank lake like Table Rock Lake or Bull Shoals or Greer's Ferry Lake in Arkansas, they're still going to relate to the bank and the bushes and the laydowns and stuff, but remember to watch that watercolor. Fish the clearer water earlier in the year, and then a little later on when the water starts warming up and gets up there and then hit that dirtier water. Usually your fish are easier to catch in dirty water once they turn on in it. It's just that they're a little slower to turn on in off-color water. If fish are biting good in off-color water and you've been doing real good, and a big front comes through, a cold front comes through, usually these fish won't be quite as affected as bad as fish on the lower end of the lake, because your dirty water retains heat longer than clear water. Another thing or situation that a springtime fishermen have to contend with is a lot of rain and high rising water. And When it's coming up fast and just really flooding, boy, that really tends to scatter the fish, and it makes them a little more difficult to find, and that's why you have to find areas that you can get to the shoreline, either that or little humps and ridges that you can just work the whole thing, because it scatters the fish out quite a bit. And then the situation that fishermen hate the worst is falling water. And no matter what kind of lake you have, falling water always makes the fish usually totally change their patterns and the places that they are. And lakes that are flat like this lake here, it pulls them out away from the bank and puts them on all these ridges and stuff that I've been fishing. And if you've got a lake that doesn't have offshore structure, it has a tendency to pull the fish to the little bit steeper banks, maybe the channel banks where the creek channel bends in close to the shoreline. They still pretty well in the same areas, but what they do is they leave the flat areas and move over on these little channel type banks where they've got a little more security. Once fish have got on the right on their springtime spawning patterns, they're not necessarily going to leave their beds. They're going to stay in these areas, but what falling water does in that situation is it makes them terrible spooky, and they're extremely hard to catch. And that's when you got to use things like tube baits and maybe a plastic worm with a real light sinker or a little bitty minnow plug, because it just makes them extremely spooky. When the fish finally moved in here a little bit, maybe that water's got up 59 degrees. Found me a little spinnerbait bass. He's still white as a ghost, though. Maybe they're gonna get started here in a minute. Tell you, that just amazes me how fast that water's warmed up. It's up to 58.5 in a period of just an hour. But you got to get out of that wind. Had to get out of that wind to get in here and find a little warmer water. You know, you can tell by right there, when you start seeing them turtles moving up on top of them logs back in these coves, that water's really warming fast. And that's when it's time to spend more time back in here pitching and casting at these bushes. I mean, we hadn't caught but one fish in 2.5 days out of a bush, but it just took one good sunny day to warm this water up a little bit, and done caught one on a spinnerbait. There's one. Trying to move back in here, but they just ain't. The better fish evidently ain't moved back in here. But time will tell. It's getting late and that water temperature's coming up fast. Getting on a little bit of a spinnerbait pattern here, just staying out from them bushes and working in between the bushes and the grass line. The weeds are down there in about 4 to 5 foot of water, and just slow rolling that spinnerbait. The fish just won't move on in there. That's why I told you earlier that springtime fishing is it's a matter of changing your patterns every day. You go in there, you flip a while, move back out, you spinnerbait a while. Just keep monitoring your conditions and hopefully keep up with the fish. It's reading all them daily conditions and the situations that you're faced with, what you're looking at. It makes some people pick up on fishing faster than others. There's one right there. Come on up there, baby. That's a little better spinnerbait bass. Boy, he's cold and sluggish. Look at there. Now that's where one of them cormorants has bit that fish. Them things can eat a 2-pound bass. And they had the grip. You can see where it had a grip on him all the way across his body there. He'll survive. Well, these fish are beginning to move in a little better and a little better. You know, one thing, that's one good thing about taking 2 or 3 days to do one of these and show people how fish move from deep to shallow. There was one in there. Another little fella. Little males are beginning to move in. Another gash on him, look at that. You know, that's funny that happens so much of the time, but a lot of your springtime bass have got that on them. And I know it's them birds. And every strike has come at least 10 to 15 feet out in front of the bushes. They're just not, they just hadn't moved in there yet. Just having to slow roll that bait and keep it down. That's one of the things about dirty water. Usually you got to keep your bait down. Fish it a little slower. There's one. That feels like a pretty good fish. Going to the back of the boat on me. Come on. Yeah, that's a nice bass right there. That's a good bass. See that belly on that fish? That's what we're looking for. They're coming in, they'll be into them bushes good. 2 or 3 more days, that water temperature gets on up there about 60, 62. Not a big bass, but a nice 3-pounder. That's a nice fish. Go on back there and spawn, bring us a bunch more bass. Woo, that water's still cold. You know, one thing you really want to watch for when you're fishing stretches of water like this that has a lot of bushes, you want to watch for the irregularities in them, the points and the cuts, a lot of brush changes. Just going down a whole row of these bushes is usually not that good. You want to find the little areas that have the points, and believe it or not, even when you find an area that's usually consistently good where you catch a lot of fish, is usually a creek or something close by. They like an underwater navigation route. There's one right on that point. Come on there, little feller. Boy, that water's off color, but that makes for good spinnerbait fishing. Nice little 2-pound bass. Getting a little more aggressive. Another little female. Oh, that spinnerbait fishing's all right. That's what's good about that spinnerbait. You can just take it, and when they finally get started, just turn the troll motor on, just keep fishing and figure out the speed. And these fish are still real sluggish, and they want it moved real slow. Solid chartreuse has been the best color for me. I'm not all the time sure that color is that important, but anytime I'm in real dingy and off-color water, I like a chartreuse or a white or a combination of chartreuse and white. Oh, right on that point bush. Another nice little fat bass. Boy, he's got spots all over him. Boy, he knocked the fire out of it. Boy, these fish are getting active now. That's the way you like it, when they get real active. Just slap the fire out of that bait. Yesterday, you wouldn't even feel one of them bite. Now, all it takes is just one good, pretty day, real still, and that bright, bright sun, no haze. You know, we've had some wind. We had some high wind today, but you get back in these protected areas and where it's calm, and it just warms up that much faster. Them fish are really moved up this evening. Another little fat female fish. That's a nice little bass. I think we'll call it a day with that one. One last cast. Can't quit on a fish catch.
Day 4. After sunshine yesterday and an overnight low of only 45 degrees, the water temperature is still around 54 to 56 degrees. Larry has elected to move to the upper end of the lake with water that is slightly more off-color. The forecast is for a 60% chance for rain by evening. Larry is confident that it should be the best day for fishing yet.
You know, another technique of looking for bass, or once you've figured out the pattern, maybe you've figured out that the fish are right in these bushes, and it's something that you need to stop and try every now and then, because you just never know when they're going to get right in the heart of that brush. And when they're in there, you have to have 25, 30-pound test line to get them fish out of there. And that's when I'll pull out the flipping stick, a 7.5-foot rod, and rig it up with a jig or a crawl worm and drop it right in the center of them bushes. And boy, you got to have that big line at times. And you just can't hardly fish it properly on a lighter rod, and that's why I use the big stick. Just swing it out there and put it right in the center of a bush. I usually like to flip when I know exactly what to flip, because when you got just lots and lots of bushes like this, it's if you don't have a key bush pattern going, or exactly which bush a fish is going to be in, you can waste a lot of time flipping. But right down in the center of that one, finally got one out of there. Look at him, he's buried up in that grass in there. Come on out of there. That's the first one I've got out of them bushes. There we go. Ain't that a nice bass? Finally beginning to get a few fish in them bushes, maybe. You just gotta keep trying different patterns. Boy, that's a good bass. That's a good looking bass. Right there on a jig. See, that fish was right in that point bush, right where he's supposed to be. You know, when you're trying to put together a flipping pattern, if you know the water's rising, that's when a lot of times them fish will get way up in this stuff. But if it's falling, that's when they really get on them isolated bushes. That's when you can really work them over. And right at this point in time, I'm not real sure whether the lake's stabilized yet. It may still be rising. The water's pretty dingy, and that's why I'm working just a little variety of everything. Once I get the pattern developed and I know exactly what type of bush they're in, then you can just go through here with a spinnerbait, and every time you see that right bush, pick your flipping stick up. There's a couple things I've got going on this little pattern right here that you want to be careful of when you're hunting these bush fish. The water's real cold. It's still cold in the 55-degree range, and you got fish coming in out of deep water, and that's what I think's going on here right now. The fish aren't holding out here on these little points because it's falling. They're holding on them because it's the first place coming out of that deep water. Here's a nice bush that ought to be right. There was another one in one of them bushes. Boy, he's got some fight in him. Tell you what, all we had to do was come up here and get in that dirtier water. Another good bass. Big old black and blue jig, about a half-ounce model, just flipping it right in them bushes on 30-pound line. That dirtier water, them fish is moving in them bushes up here. That's a nice fish. Leave, I'll see if I can do that again. Nobody home. There's another one right down in that. That dude was buried in that bush. I'll tell you what, it only took that beautiful day yesterday when them fish turned onto that spinnerbait. It warmed this dirtier water up. We just moved on up the lake a little farther. Got up here where the water's a lot dingier, and when you get up into an area like this, where you don't have the grass, you've really only got one cover, and that's the bushes. And there's only two baits that you really need to throw up here, and that's a spinnerbait and a jig, because that water is so off color. And when them fish move in, they like to butt their noses right up against that bush. All right, this is just an area. We got a little wind blowing in here. Should have a little shad blowed in here, and you really don't have anything specific to fish. So the only thing really this area in here is good with is a spinnerbait, or if the water was just a little clearer, maybe a rattling crankbait of some sort. But I mean, where in the world would you expect to catch one flipping? I don't see anything outstanding, so I'd switch to a spinnerbait when I'm in this type of water. Looky there, one last big fish. You know, it clouded up on us and the weather changed, and they come out of them bushes and went right back to a spinnerbait, hit it way out away from the brush. That's a nice one to quit on. Come here, baby. Good fish. Beautiful bass. Beautiful bass. Well, I'll tell you what, folks, I just really hope that in some way I've helped you learn a lot more about bass fishing. We've covered 3 parts of the lake. We've had every kind of weather condition that you can think of. And I'll tell you what, it's been tough. But we put together a pattern in clear water, dingy water, and muddy water. And hopefully this will help you to become a better bass fisherman. Good bass.
We would like to thank the following sponsors who have helped make this presentation possible. Bomber, Cotton Cordell, Rebel, and Hedden, crankbaits and topwater plugs for all your fishing needs. Nitro High Performance Bass Boats by Tracker Marine, fish the finest. Daiwa Rods and Reels, serious equipment for the serious fisherman. Daiwa, committed to total quality. Eagle, offering a full line of marine electronics. You can find all these products and over 14,000 other fishing and sporting good items in the Bass Pro Shops Outdoor World catalogs.
We hope you've enjoyed this presentation and would like to take this opportunity to invite you to visit the Bass Pro Shops national headquarters in Springfield, Missouri. Outdoor World, with over 150,000 square feet of shopping magic. A showcase for everything found in the Bass Pro catalogs and much more. Waterfalls, restaurants, 5 fresh and saltwater aquariums, endless displays of top-quality hunting gear, and the largest fishing department in the world. Visit the Outdoor World showroom today, and for our latest catalog, call 1-800-BASS-PRO. The catalog's free, and so is the call. Thank you for letting us help you have fun outdoors.